These strange and scary photos from history only show a small part of the horror that was experienced by the people who lived through the events captured. The photos can help bring these scary historical moments to life and close the gap between past and present. Number 10. On April 1st, 1960, a Filipino man named Rufino Bering was out fishing off Mactan Island. While alone on his boat, he spotted a strange object poke out of the water. He believed that he had come face to face with a sea monster and painted the name of St. Peter and St. Paul on his boat. What he had actually seen was the periscope of a submarine, and a National Geographic photographer snapped his photo from beneath the water. He was the only person to see the USS Triton during its mission to circumnavigate the globe. Operation Sandblast had been concocted the previous year. After the Soviet Union put Sputnik into space, the United States was looking for ways to score military or technological victories. The US space program hadn't seen much success, so President Eisenhower was convinced to look elsewhere. Up until this point, submarines typically spent most of their time above the water. They would only dive after getting close to their targets, so they could fire torpedoes. But technology was changing. The advent of nuclear power meant submarines could spend more time submerged, and one had already navigated beneath the ice of the North Pole. The next mission was to go all the way around the world completely submerged. The mission was kept top secret. Even the crew that was to go on the journey didn't know what they were doing until they were already out at sea. The USS Triton was chosen as it was the largest and fastest submarine that had been created up until that point. It was also the first that went faster when submerged than on the surface. The submarine left its home port of New London on the 16th of February, and only once they were far out at sea did the captain reveal the plan. The first stop was St. Peter and Paul Rocks in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This was to be the official start and end point. From there, the crew followed roughly the same path as Ferdinand Magellan had during the first ever circumnavigation of the world. Even though the engine didn't require air to work, there were other things that did. Every day, the submarine would come close to the surface so a snorkel could ventilate and replenish the air on board. The periscope was also used to fix the position and help with navigation. The only time the boat came close to surfacing was in the early hours of March 5th. One of the men on board was suffering from a bad case of kidney stones and needed to be evacuated. The Triton rendezvoused with the heavier cruiser USS Macron and rose to the point where the submarine's sail just breached the water. It didn't technically surface, but it was enough so that the sailor could be evacuated. After that, the submarine dove again and wouldn't be seen until Rufino Bering spotted it almost a month later. Along the way, there were many technical problems, including seals breaking, navigation equipment malfunctioning, and a reactor having to be shut down. But each problem was dealt with. On April 25th, 60 days and 21 hours after leaving St. Peter and Paul Rocks, the submarine reached the Central Atlantic Islands again, officially completing the circumnavigation. The boat continued to Spain and then returned to the US, where many of the photos taken through the periscope were published in the National Geographic. After the publication, the photographer sought out Rufino to learn what he thought of the strange encounter. The fisherman had never imagined he was witnessing history when he spotted the strange artifact poke out of the water. Number 9. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit with nuclear weapons, only a few people on the planet knew what had happened. The Manhattan Project was a feat of engineering and scientific brilliance in its most horrifying form, but also an achievement for secrecy. The atmosphere of secrecy was highlighted by creepy billboards encouraging workers to keep quiet. The United States started looking into building an atomic weapon in 1939. For the first 3 decades of the 20th century, there had been many scientific breakthroughs in understanding of how the atom worked. With the beginning of World War II, it was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to use this new technology to create more powerful and more devastating weapons. The US was determined to achieve this before the Axis powers. The Manhattan Project was a 3-year-long project, first approved on October 9, 1941. It involved tens of thousands of people, working mostly in 3 sites spread across the United States. The most famous of these was Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the main laboratories and construction sites were housed. Keeping something a secret with so many people involved was a major task. Each person working on the project had a background check to make sure they had no criminal history and no connections to anything suspicious. But even when nothing in their past indicated that they would break the secrecy, that wasn't enough to ensure that it wouldn't happen. A policy of compartmentalization was one of the main ways to keep information secret. People couldn't reveal classified information if they didn't know it. Most of the workers on the Manhattan Project had no idea what they were really working on. People worked on their tasks, isolated from what the others were doing. This caused some problems at higher levels, though. The reason why there have been so many advances in science in recent years was due to collaboration and the sharing of ideas. When problems came up, scientists needed to discuss them and listen to ideas they never would have come up with. The military leaders eventually gave in and allowed the top-secret scientists to have more open discussions, but this was still limited to only those at the very top. Even though most people only knew a little information, there was still a worry that it could get out. If enough people revealed the little that they knew, someone might be able to piece together what was going on. It was relatively easy to keep track of people who might want to reveal secrets. A bigger concern was people accidentally revealing too much. Idle talk was a real concern, and a propaganda campaign was developed to make sure it didn't expose the project. At sites like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, billboards were put up with slogans reminding people to keep quiet. The most famous of these slogans read, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." It reminded people that these were effectively enclosed cities and that the outside world couldn't know what was going on. Other billboards reminded workers of the dangers that could be faced if news of the atomic weapons got out. Another billboard had the slogan, "Your pen and tongue can be enemy weapons." It was a reminder that there were really lives on the line. Some spies managed to infiltrate the program, but for the most part, the security worked to keep the secrets of the Manhattan Project from the public until after the first, and so far only, wartime use of the weapons. Number 8. When X-rays were first discovered, they were used for everything from hair removal to shoe fitting. As we learned more and more about the dangers of this radiation, campaigns began to stop the non-essential use of X-rays. Even as these campaigns were taking place, procedures like the one photographed at the De Beers diamond mine in South Africa were taking place. The theft of raw diamonds by workers has always been a concern for mine owners. Over the years, miners have come up with ingenious ways to smuggle the gemstones out of their place of work without being noticed. One method involved smuggling in specially trained pigeons, usually in lunchboxes, and tying the stones to the birds. These birds would then fly home and deposit their riches with the smugglers, away from the security of the mines themselves. A simpler method involved hiding the stones within the body. They were usually ingested, but sometimes workers would try to hide small crystals in wounds in their legs. The X-ray was introduced to try to stop that from happening. The procedures began as early as 1919. Every worker leaving the mine would have to go through an X-ray procedure. Workers would stand in front of a device that fired X-rays at them, and an examiner would use a fluorescent screen to see the X-rays that were passing through the body. In the viral photo of a worker being X-rayed, the device that's being held isn't actually the X-ray machine itself, but the screen that makes the rays visible. Diamonds themselves are almost invisible on X-rays. The gemstones are made out of carbon and have roughly the same density as tissue in the human body. If the workers were swallowing refined diamonds, the procedure would be useless. But these diamonds were often still embedded in the stone they were grown in, which did show up on the X-rays. On top of this, the fear of being caught would undoubtedly have helped to stop some miners even attempting to smuggle out diamonds. This practice went on for decades, even as the scientific community realized the dangers of the radiation. Going through this procedure every day would be dangerous to employees, and giving the procedure would be even more dangerous. Rather than stopping it or coming up with new methods to stop thefts, the company worked to make X-ray procedures safer. They would eventually come up with an X-ray device that produced much less radiation. it was also quicker, taking a matter of seconds to make a clearer image. This technology would be refined to create the Lattice device, a machine that's used in emergency rooms in South Africa and around the world. Rather than trying to spot diamonds, the device is used to assess patients and is especially useful for spotting bullets. Meanwhile, X-ray scanners are still used to try to combat theft at mines, as well as a number of other techniques. For those that do actually manage to smuggle gemstones away from mines, there isn't much profit. The raw diamond isn't sold for that much money on the black market. For some, the small amount of money is worth the risk. Others see it as taking back control of the land and what's hidden beneath it. Number 7. The Texas City disaster was one of the most terrifying industrial accidents in history. Hundreds of dock workers, firefighters, and bystanders lost their lives when cargo aboard an ordinary ship caught fire, leading to a chain reaction that devastated the entire port. It began with a fire on the SS Grand Camp, which was caught in eerie photographs taken at the time. Photos showed dock workers and firefighters trying to put out what they thought would be a typical fire, completely unaware of what was going to happen. The SS Grand Camp had docked at the Texas City docks the previous day, and work had begun packing the cargo of fertilizer, tobacco, ammunition, and peanuts into the holds. Work resumed at about 8 a.m. on the morning of April 16th. Workers noticed smoke coming from one of the holds, but they weren't immediately alarmed. Fires weren't uncommon at the docks, and they began the typical procedures of passing through fire extinguishers to try to put out the blaze. It soon became apparent that this wasn't going to be easily put out, and fire crews were called. The fire also attracted bystanders who would often come to the docks to watch the more serious fires. That meant there were a lot of people hanging around when the fertilizer cargo detonated at 9:12 a.m. The blast tore apart the SS Grand Camp, sending pieces of the ship thousands of feet into the air and throwing large chunks into the surrounding area. A tidal wave was sent onto the shore, along with some of the barges that were in the water. Warehouses were flattened and houses were damaged miles away. In Denver, Colorado, the blast was detected by seismographs. Photographs of the docks looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster, but things would get worse. There were 2 ships at the docks that day. One was the SS High Flyer, which was also undergoing repairs to the propeller while cargo was loaded onto the ship. Luckily, it was far enough away that it didn't suffer too much damage from the Grand Camp's eruption, although at least one sailor lost his life. More concern was the possibility of secondary fires starting on board the ship. The sailors knew that the cargo aboard was just as dangerous as the Grand Camp's cargo. No fires had started yet, but being close to the Grand Camp and the smoldering wreck of the pier was dangerous. Unfortunately, the sailors were unable to raise the anchor, and the decision was made to abandon the ship. Hours later, barges were sent from Galveston to try to detach the anchor, but this was also hopeless. That evening, the High Flyer went the same way as the Grand Camp, and more damage was done to the dock. Thankfully, this secondary blast was anticipated, and the area had been cleared of most personnel. The impact of this second blast was mostly to buildings and to the 3rd ship that was in the dock. The ship was carrying a cargo of mostly flour. While it was completely wrecked, it didn't go the same way as the other 2 ships that day. The cause of the initial fire was never determined. An investigation into the disaster found that no smoking rules weren't followed by many of the people working on or around the ships. It seemed likely that a discarded cigarette butt had caused the fire, but it was impossible to determine for sure. A total of 581 people lost their lives in the disaster, more than any other industrial accident in U.S. history. The photographs from this event can only provide some idea of just how truly terrifying it really was. Number 6. The period between 1920 and 1933 was a strange time in American history. The production, sale, and transportation of alcohol was strictly prohibited. This led to an increase in crime and in the creativity of people trying to get around the new Prohibition-era laws. In 1922, a Prohibition enforcement officer discovered something strange near a distillery in Florida. It was a human shoe with cow hooves carved into the sole. A photo of the officer wearing the shoe appeared in local newspapers, warning law enforcement of a creative method that moonshiners had been using to get away with their crimes. Moonshining was nothing new, especially in the American South. The practice is often used to refer to any homemade alcohol, but it specifically meant homemade whiskey. People had been making their own alcohol illegally since the American Revolution, after which the government attempted to tax alcohol. Of course, people tried to get around these rules, and moonshining became popular in states like Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas. That popularity only increased after the Prohibition laws came into effect. It had been a popular movement that had introduced the new laws in the first place, but almost immediately, people tried to find ways to get around them. The use of alcohol for medicinal and religious purposes wasn't prohibited. Much of the alcohol that was set aside for these purposes found its way into speakeasies and other places where people drank for leisure. Others brought in the drink from outside the US. But for those that had been making alcohol themselves for generations or didn't have access to these other methods, moonshining was the best option. Those looking to enforce the Prohibition laws were on the lookout for the distilleries, though. These would often be located in isolated areas such as fields. That made them very hard to find unless officers knew where to look. If someone were to spot human footprints in places where humans didn't typically go, that was an obvious sign that there was something suspicious going on. Following these footprints would easily lead to the stills, or to the people who had been operating them. Some moonshiners decided the best way to hide their presence was to disguise their footprints as those of an animal that would typically be in these fields. Law enforcement officers thought that the criminals might have gotten the idea from a Sherlock Holmes story. In the Priory School, the famous detective noticed that a track of cow hoof prints had been laid unusually. The cow wasn't just walking, but was cantering and galloping like a horse. The criminal in the story had changed his horse's shoes to resemble cow prints to fool authorities. Moonshiners counted on the fact that it wouldn't be a world-class detective who was hunting them. They copied the method by carving cow hooves into wood, which were then secured onto their shoes. Anybody used to inspecting cow prints would notice that the layout of the tracks didn't make sense, but most Prohibition officers wouldn't have been looking that closely at the tracks. Unfortunately for these moonshiners, their distillery was found, and at least one of these ingenious shoes was left behind. Local law enforcement showed off the shoe in the local newspaper, warning others of the trick and forcing moonshiners to come up with other ideas. Number 5. In recent years, this historic photo of US President Lyndon B. Johnson has been seen as representing the turmoil someone in a position of power might go through when faced with an impossible decision. The reality of the photo is less poignant, but still captures a human moment in one of the most terrible times in recent US history. Over 10 years into the Vietnam War, the situation on the ground for US and South Vietnamese soldiers didn't seem to be getting any better. 1968 was the most intense period of the war up until that point, and there was apparently no end in sight. Months before this photo was taken, the Tet Offensive had begun. North Vietnamese soldiers and sympathizers had used the Lunar New Year holidays as a cover to get into position for a massive offensive in the South. It started in January, but the later phases of the Tet Offensive were still continuing in the summer, at the time the photo was taken. For the Viet Cong and their allies, the Tet Offensive was a major mistake. They had hoped that it would be a major blow to the US forces and bring a swift end to the war. Instead, many more people from the North lost their lives in the fighting than those in the South. Tens or even hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese fighters would lose their lives. But the Tet Offensive wasn't without cost for the Americans. Over the course of 1968, over 16,000 Americans lost their lives in the fighting, and many more were wounded. As was so often the case during the war, the cost to civilians was even higher. Even though the US forces may have won the battle, it was a terrible propaganda blow. Back home, people were learning every day that loved ones would not be returning home. President Johnson increased the maximum number of US soldiers that would fight in Vietnam, and it seemed like the horrors of war that were being broadcast on TV would never end. Johnson himself also had people on the front lines to worry about. His son-in-law, Charles Chuck Robb, was a captain fighting in Vietnam. In the summer of 1968, he sent a voice recording to his wife. It was this recording that Johnson was listening to when the famous photograph was taken. The president, aides, and photographers were sent into the cabinet room to listen to the tape. It was difficult to hear what was said, even when the tape was transferred to a new recording. The photo seems to show Johnson breaking down in despair as he listens to the tape. In actuality, he was simply straining to make out the words. But that's not to say he wasn't moved by what was being said. It was a personal message to Robb's wife, and Robb talked about how many people he had lost in the fighting. Robb said he was lucky because many times he had moved away from a particular spot that was hit just moments later. Throughout the recording, there was the sound of weapons being fired. This showed how soldiers couldn't even get a few minutes to talk to their wives without the fighting continuing. The recording ended with static. The Vietnam War would continue for another 5 years. Number 4. In 1930, one of the most devastating fires in American history broke out at the Ohio State Penitentiary. 322 people lost their lives in what was an avoidable tragedy, and hundreds more were injured. A famous photo of the blaze shows the building alight and partially obscured by smoke, while a few people stand just outside the walls. No rush to save the people caught in the fire is pictured, which hints at the horrors that took place that night. The Ohio State Penitentiary wasn't fit for purpose. It was first opened in the 1830s, and since then hadn't developed at anywhere near the rate that was needed. The roof of the prisoner wings was decaying, and there was no fire prevention system in place. On top of that, the overcrowding was horrendous. The prison was built to house 1,500 people. At the time of the fire, 4,300 inmates were incarcerated there. The overcrowded conditions had already led to a cholera outbreak that claimed many lives, but the fire would be much worse. Steps were being made to reduce overcrowding, and a new section of the prison was being built. Scaffolding had already been put up along the west wall of the prison, and it was here that the fire started. Candles placed on oily rags started the fire in the early evening of April 21st, just as prisoners were being locked up for the night. Guards were informed of the fire, which was slow-moving but spreading along the west wall. Instead of going to fight the fire or moving the prisoners to a safer location, the guards continued to lock up inmates as normal. Prisoners begged to be released. Some asked for guards to take their lives quickly rather than succumb to the flames, but their cries were ignored. Eventually, a few prisoners managed to overpower their guards, taking the keys and beginning to release prisoners. About 50 prisoners were released before the smoke became too much for the rescue effort to continue. By this point, the blaze had spread to the roof. The rotting wood was perfect fuel for the fire, and it was obvious that it wouldn't last long. The prison warden contacted a local military base for assistance. He believed the fire was part of some mass prison break effort and wanted more guards to ensure that didn't happen. Men lined the outer walls of the prison with weapons, ensuring that nobody escaped. Eventually, the local fire department was also called. By this time, a riot had broken out, with prisoners throwing stones at guards. When the firefighters showed up, they were also pelted with projectiles. The firefighters forced their way through and got the blaze under control. The roof of the prison had already collapsed, claiming the lives of those who were trapped on the top floor of the prison. Many prisoners passed away from smoke inhalation, and others had a more painful passing. Local newspapers were horrified by this disturbing moment in history. Photographs from the aftermath of the fire showed just how devastating the blaze had been. They showed the almost completely destroyed areas of the prison, with collapsed and charred wooden beams. Even more disturbing are the photographs of rows of coffins, showing the human cost of the fire. In the aftermath, calls for prison reforms grew louder, and legislation was put in place to try to reduce overcrowding and improve fire safety protocols within prisons. The exact cause of the blaze was never determined. The authorities insisted that prisoners had intentionally started the fire, and even pointed to 3 individuals they believed responsible. But the truth still remains a mystery. Number 3. Historical photographs of iron lung wards might look like something out of an old science fiction movie. Rows and rows of metal tubes lined the wards, with patients inserted all the way up to their necks. At the time these were used, they would have actually seemed like science fiction. But far from being a horror, these were often the end of horrifying experiences for the people who used them. Even though the idea of iron lungs had come about decades earlier, it was with the beginning of the polio epidemics that iron lung wards started to become standard features in hospitals across Europe and North America. Polio was a terrifying disease which mostly affected children. Before an effective vaccine was developed in the 1950s, hundreds of thousands of people contracted the disease. Many passed away, while others suffered lifelong disabilities due to the disease. The virus impacted the nervous system, which could lead to muscle paralysis. When this paralyzed the muscles in the legs and arms, it would obviously be a very scary scenario, but one that the patient would probably live through. Once the disease passed, it was sometimes even possible for people to regain the use of these muscles. But a much more terrifying experience was when the muscles in the chest stopped working. These muscles controlled the lungs, and if they couldn't move, then the lungs would stay still. In a short span of time, people would lose the use of their lungs and go into a coma, and many would never wake up. The only way for someone with this level of paralysis to survive was if something expanded and contracted the muscles for them. In that way, the iron lung was an ingenious and life-saving invention, even if the machine itself did look scary. Patients were placed inside the metal tube all the way up to their necks. The tube was then sealed with a rubber collar around the neck, making sure it was as airtight as possible. A set of bellows attached to the tube would slowly suck the air out, reducing the air pressure. This forced the patient's lungs to expand and allowed the patient to inhale. The bellows would then push air back into the tube, and the lungs would contract again, gently forcing the patient to exhale. People who used the iron lungs described the relief they experienced when they were first placed inside the chamber. Up until that point, they would have been struggling to get oxygen into their systems, trapped in a body that was essentially frozen in place. Suddenly, the struggle was over. Even though they didn't have control over their lungs themselves, it was a relief to no longer have to worry about it. The iron lungs didn't actually do anything to cure the disease. At the time, there was no cure. Symptoms could be managed, but it was up to the body's immune system to fight the virus off. Most people only used the iron lung for a few weeks until the infection ended. They would gradually be released for short periods until their muscles grew strong enough for them to breathe without thinking about it. Unfortunately, sometimes the paralysis remained, even after the virus had disappeared. Some people would spend the rest of their lives in iron lungs. With the help of carers, they could still lead long lives. A man named Paul Alexander lived in an iron lung for over 70 years. He was only able to breathe on his own for a few hours at a time. When he passed away in 2024, Paul was the last man to live in this life-saving device. Number 2. Historical photographs of the aftermath of the Johnstown Flood can't come close to depicting just how terrifying the disaster would have been for those unfortunate enough to be caught up in it. An entire community lost everything they owned. Thousands of people lost their lives. May 31st, 1889 seemed like any other day for the residents of Johnstown. Water was already beginning to pour into the lower floors of their homes and businesses, but this was nothing too unusual. The town was built where two rivers combined to form the Conemaugh River, and flooding had been the norm in this area for decades. Heavy periods of rain or sudden snowmelt would send water flooding from the surrounding mountains and cause the rivers to break their banks. But the residents would just move their belongings up to higher floors and wait out the flood. That was exactly what they were doing on the day of the disaster. Further upstream, workers at the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were much more concerned. 30 years before the disaster, a dam was built over the river to create a reservoir. It had originally been for a canal system, but had been taken over by the Leisure Club that used the lake for fishing. They'd never taken maintenance of the dam too seriously, and removed elements that would allow them to control the water. There'd already been some damage to the dam, but it had held. Now it looked like that wouldn't last much longer. Frantic work was conducted to try to relieve pressure on the earthen dam, but it was too little too late. At 3:15 p.m., the dam burst. The disaster would have resembled something similar to a tsunami. A wall of water and debris came thundering down the river, sweeping away settlements in its wake. It took a little under an hour for it to reach Johnstown. No warning came, but even if there had been warning, there was little residents could do as they were trapped in the upper floors of their homes. Entire buildings were swept away. Locomotives, twisted railway tracks, and anything else that had stood in the way of the wall of water were all carried downstream. It seemed to be a matter of luck rather than anything else that determined who survived the water. The piles of debris came crashing down on the Pennsylvania Railroad Company's stone bridge, where it finally stopped. The debris piled up 40 feet high and stretched over 30 acres. Somehow, the debris here caught fire, and those trapped inside the broken buildings were unable to escape. In just a short span of time, the disaster was over. The fire continued to burn at the stone bridge for several days, but the water had finished its work. News of the disaster quickly spread both around the country and internationally. Photographs showed the aftermath. It looked unlikely that anything would ever be rebuilt here. Even once all the wreckage was cleared, a thick layer of mud still covered every surface. Waterborne diseases were another problem. Some of those who had managed to survive the initial disaster fell victim to the after effects. But despite how hopeless it must have seemed when these photos were taken, the residents of Johnstown and the surrounding communities were rebuilt. Unfortunately, lessons weren't learned from the disaster. The Johnstown Flood was a man-made disaster, but people saw the dam breaking as an act of God rather than something that could have been avoided. Many more floods would come in the decades that followed. Number 1. On December 23, 1972, the horrifying ordeal of 16 young men in the Andes Mountains came to an end when rescue teams finally found them. It was 72 days after the plane they were on crashed into the mountains, and many of the survivors were little more than skin and bones by the time they were found. The strange historic event would be remembered as the miracle of the Andes. Photographs taken during those 72 days show the men appearing to be in good spirits, although the broken wreckage of the plane in the background hints at some of the darkest things anybody has ever experienced. The event began on the 13th of October, 1972. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was loaded with 40 passengers and 5 crew members, including inexperienced pilots. Many of those on board were part of a rugby team that was flying to Santiago in Chile for a rugby match. Others were the team's family and friends, and some medical students. The flight had already been delayed due to bad weather, and conditions weren't much better on the 13th, but the flight went ahead. At first, the passengers didn't think the turbulence was anything to worry about, but when the plane dipped below the cloud cover, they noticed that they were flying extremely close to the mountains. There was no time for the pilot to avoid impact. The crash took place a little after 3:30 p.m. Part of the plane came apart, and 7 of those aboard were pulled out of the craft. 5 others passed away on impact. The remaining 33 passengers and crew members were stranded in a glacier with no way of contacting anybody for help. In the outside world, a search effort began, but there was little hope of finding anybody alive. The white plane blended with the snow-covered mountains, making it almost impossible to spot. After 8 days of searching, the effort was called off. At the crash site, the remaining survivors heard the news over a transistor radio. They knew that the only way they were going to survive was if they rescued themselves. But they initially planned to wait with the plane until conditions improved. It was late spring, and the survivors believed that summer would be the best time to try to make their way back to civilization. Using foil from the seats, they were able to heat snow for clean drinking water. The wrecked plane also provided shelter. The only thing they were lacking was food. As time passed, the number of survivors dwindled. Some passed away due to wounds they'd suffered in the crash. Others couldn't survive the freezing conditions without food. After over a week without food, the survivors agreed that they would use the remains of their fellow passengers to survive. They also volunteered up their own bodies for food if they passed away. The decision makes the photographs taken at the wreck site even more chilling. But even with that disturbing decision made, the dwindling survivors knew they wouldn't last much longer. After 60 days alone in the snow, 3 of the survivors began their trek over the mountains to try to get help. One had to turn back due to a lack of supplies. That left just Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa. They had no climbing supplies and weren't outfitted for the weather. They were also incredibly weak, but they still managed to trek over 33 miles over 10 days until they found a man on horseback on the other side of a river. By throwing a rock with a note on it, they were able to communicate that they were survivors of a plane crash, and there were 14 others still in the mountains. Helicopters were sent out, guided by Parado. At first, he worried that he wouldn't be able to find his friends again, but they appeared like black specks against the white snow. 72 days after the crash, 16 people were rescued and reunited with their families. The story of their survival has gone on to inspire books, documentaries, and films, many of which recreated the photos that were taken in the Valley of Tears. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.